All right. Thank you, folks, for coming in and for the show. Today, we have amazing guest. Before I introduce our amazing guest, I would like to just kind of lay some house rules. This is a spotlight series in which we kind of every month with the Black Cultural Center kind of highlight Black faculty and staff around campus. And for them to get a chance, we bring the audience to them and essentially giving them the chance to just present on any research that they've had or they've done in the past. And really, you know, we oftentimes don't necessarily get Black folk to really kind of just talk about things that are interesting to them or just research that they're working on. And so with this Research Spotlight series, we wanted to kind of do this. And we've been doing it since last year. So it's been great. We've had several different professors here on campus kind of present. And today we have Professor Culver today. So with that, I'm going to introduce Professor Culver. For the last 2 years, 2018 to 2020, Leslie P. Culver was a visiting professor at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. At the college, Professor Culver taught in the first year skills program. In addition, she created and taught an upper level seminar titled Identity, Power, and Professional Responsibility. Prior to the UCI, Professor Culver was a faculty member at the California Western School of Law. There she taught in the first year legal skills program and taught the legal scholarship training seminar, Women in Law and Race in Law. At California Western, she also directed A.I.M for Law, a diversity pipeline program for underrepresented college students. Prior to teaching, Professor Culver clerked for 2 appellate judges and later practiced as a civil rights litigator in St. Louis, Missouri. After 11 years, Professor Culver left Southern California and joined the faculty at the University of Utah's Law School in the fall of 2020, where she teaches legal methods and her upper level identity seminar, and will continue her leadership in the cultural awareness dialogues and assisting with diversity pipeline programs at the Utah Law. Professor Culver's scholarship focuses on conscious identity performance, which intersects the work of both legal scholars and feminist communication theories as a tool for traditionally marginalized groups to navigate their identity in homogeneous legal profession. Can we give a round of applause, a silent round of applause for Professor Culver?
Thank you all so much. Okay, I am very excited to be here. Thank you. And I shout out to my College of Law faculty. Thank you so much for being here. This is interrupting our faculty meeting, and our dean, bless her soul, pushed our faculty meeting back. So I was like, oh, they have to come now for at least 20 minutes. They have to be here. So there we go. Love it. So I just very brief. Thank you, Malaji, for the introduction. I moved here in May during the madness that was happening in the world. What unfortunately was not even able to kind of come and tour around and sort of visit. It was just like, just throw your stuff in a U-Haul and get here and sort of find a place on the way. So it's pretty much what my family and I did. So I am here with my 2 girls, 5 and 7-year-old, and then my husband. So we are loving Utah so far. We were promised snow. So if anybody has that in the pipeline, we would appreciate some snow because my girls want to go sledding. So let me give a little, I'm just going to kind of jump right into the presentation. At any point, if there are questions, please just put them in the queue. Our wonderful moderator can kind of let me know if it's a question that I should sort of stop and pause on right now, or if it's one that can kind of wait. So I want to kind of present some of my work. So here we go. So hopefully my screen share will work appropriately. Okay. Okay, come on, big print. All right. So I don't want that. My work is on conscious identity performance, and I want to, this broadly frames everything that I do. It all is kind of stemming from this. So I kind of consider this a seminal piece, even though I've had some pieces that were written before this piece, and then certainly some that have come after, but this is really the framework. So I kind of want to just walk you through a bit of how I arrived here, what it means, and what I am doing with it. And if there are any potential collaboration opportunities that you see with some of the work that you're doing or things that you're interested in, please do reach out to me, because I'm interested in that as well. Okay, so my research question, oh, come on, Prezi. Here was the question that I sort of began with. I had written a previous piece called White Doors, Black Footsteps, leveraging white privilege for the benefit of students of color. And I did that largely in part to some of my own experiences that I had had in practice. I was one of 3 Black attorneys in my large litigation firm of about 300 or 400 people in St. Louis, Missouri. And I literally just didn't have the tools to process the different things that were happening around me. And it wasn't anything that I'm going to say is traumatic in the way in certain experiences. But when I look back, I'm like, how come I didn't get that opportunity and that person had that opportunity? How come, this person seemed to have an easier time doing this and this was incredibly difficult for me, right? And as I just start to kind of question this, how come, I turned in something to a partner and I had a proofreading error and the partner never did any more work with me like ever again. And I was like, I didn't really see that happening with other people. So I don't really understand what I am doing wrong, right? And I didn't have the tools, and I ended up basically just leaving my law firm, right? And I'm like, who does that? Who walks away in their mid-20s from 6 figures? And I did. And so I was trying to kind of figure out and process, how do I kind of navigate this? And then I started teaching, and I found that there were similar experiences that my students of color were also having in the classroom, in the profession, and I'm trying to kind of figure out, how do we sort of navigate this? So that first piece was really, hey, my colleagues who are perceived as or identify as white, here are things that you can do to kind of make these spaces a bit easier and a bit more palatable for students of color. And really, it was like my heart cry, right? I wish I had known this when I was sitting in your classroom. I wish you would have done this, right? So this piece now, though, this question that I then embarked upon was, okay, well, now having kind of had that conversation, how do I have this same conversation to other people that may look like me in different sort of marginalized identities? So that became my question, right? How do non-dominant groups, right? How do I, sitting in a classroom of 2 other black folks and otherwise a class that has 80 white students, how do I get heard? How do I communicate in that space? And that was really my question. And I was like, somebody has got to have thought about this or talked about this. And when I initially went to the legal scholarship, I just wasn't finding much luck. And I'm going to talk about that second, but I want to mention something now with that. All the roads seem to lead to assimilation. Like, if you want to figure out how to communicate, you change. That's what you do. And you do it either by covering, or you do it by passing, or you do it in some of those ways. But I was like, but what if I don't want to do that, right? Because I felt like I did that unconsciously while I was at my law firm. So where that took me to was a lot of interdisciplinary work. And so this for me was fascinating. I hope you find it interesting. Of course, when it's also your own work, you of course are like, I love this stuff. And everyone else is like, oh, that's precious, Professor Culver, you're so precious, right? I think this stuff is fascinating. All right. So I had to move away from legal scholarship because legal scholarship just simply wasn't helpful in this area. So I was like, okay, I literally Googled the stuff that I tell my law students not to do. I'm like, don't Google, have a very intelligent research plan. I literally Googled, right? I was like, minorities communicating in majority setting. I just started with all the terminology that I knew. And then that kind of started sparking conversations about, and I started seeing terms like non-dominant, dominant. I was like, okay, yeah, let's go with that. So that ended up leading me to the same 2 people, Edwin and Shirley Ardener. Right. Once I got out of the legal space and I just went very broad interdisciplinary. It led me to these 2 people. So here, let me talk briefly about who these 2 lovely people are. So Edwin and Shirley Ardener were ethnographers. And so they were big into anthropology and that whole field. And they had done they were on an ethnography sort of study, and actually specifically Edwin was. I don't know that Shirley had sort of joined them at this particular study. And he was studying the Bakwari people in Cameroon. And from an ethnography standpoint, was simply observing, right? So if you know anything about ethnography, you are just literally kind of stepping back and you're kind of observing how that culture communicates and what they do. And you're studying the things that are both said and not said. And one thing that one of the ethnographers sort of noticed is that they were specifically trying to learn about the female puberty rights, right? So that deals with women, right? They're literally trying to understand, so these sort of rites of passage for women. And it was the men that kept educating the ethnographers on, well, this is what this looks like. This is how this sort of flows, right? So it's a female puberty rite of passage, but yet it was the men that were constantly sort of talking about it. And that kind of piqued something else. So they didn't go into this study or this opportunity saying like, hey, let's come up with a theory about and think about how men and women communicate. They weren't looking at that. They were actually trying to study this rites of passage, but it was the men that were constantly talking. So it took kind of a different turn. So then when they found that they were actually trying to talk to the women of the group, the women were constantly giggling. It was like they weren't really offering, okay, well, here's this happens, then this happens, then this happens, here's this stage, here's this stage. They weren't really offering that kind of communication. So when the ethnographers sort of like walked away, they were like, it's interesting because here is a rite of passage that really is centering on a particular gender, yet it was the opposite gender that was being the voice of everything, right? So for that reason, one of the comments then that stuck with me that Edwin and his team kind of came away with said, you know, we are for practical purposes in a male world. The study of women, which is what they went to do, is on a level little higher than the study of ducks and fowls they commonly own, mere bird watching indeed. It is the very inarticulateness of women that is the technical part of the problem they present. So I want to be clear with this. And it was actually one of his research assistants that kind of flippantly sort of was like, it was like they were muted, right? And that's how we kind of came up with this like sort of muted group theory. But it wasn't that they were unable to speak by any stretch of the imagination. It was, they were giggling, and the way that they were sort of talking was just rendered not understandable, right? Inarticulate for the ethnographers. So that kind of began this muted group theory. And so that's really where it began. Now from there, this muted group theory, as always happens with any theory that begins anywhere, it makes its way to the United States. And it does so through a feminist theorist named Cheris Kramre. And so she wrote this book called Women and Men Speaking. And so what she was doing was she actually was kind of engaged with the thought process that I kind of found myself on too, which was literally, how do women and men speak? How do they speak in the same setting, and what does that look like? And so she was looking for theoretical frameworks that she could kind of pin her thoughts on, and wanting to see what worked best, right? So she wasn't just stopping on the muted group theory. She was looking at several different frameworks, but she landed on the muted group theory as being the one that most described what she had observed in her own studies, right? And so she was like, because men determine the acceptable values and models of the world, women have had to learn the language and the structure of the dominant group. And men have seldom had to discern or have wanted to discern the women's model of the world, right? So that literally, if women wanted to, from her studies, if women wanted to be heard, they had to adopt a male idiom in order to do so. And so in effect, again, they were rendered mute. Not because they could not talk, but because the idiom that they were used to, the language that they were used to speaking of, was one that wasn't generally acceptable. So it was literally like they were not heard. Okay, fascinating. I love this stuff. Love it. Okay, all right. So then we get to 1972. Dorothy Smith, Canadian psychologist, she and a couple of other people with her developed this standpoint theory. All right, so now her standpoint theory, and the way that I always remember and that I always teach it, is just to look at this elephant, right? Depending upon where you are looking at this elephant, you will see something different, very, very different. And where I always challenge students, and where I also have to remain challenged, is depending upon where you're standing, it is very real. It is very true to you. To say to the person who's looking at sort of the back end, right, that it's a rope, and yell across to the front person who says it's a spear, and to say you're wrong, you have to watch yourself, because it's like, no, if we actually go from their perspective, they're right. Now they also need to kind of come around to our perspective. So that's how she came up with this standpoint theory. And So since life perspectives emerge from one's daily life experience, knowledge, this is interesting, right? Knowledge from the standpoint of the marginalized group members cannot be fully grasped by those people who are in the dominant group setting. So when you are standing on sort of the outside, if you will, you can actually see more than if you are kind of standing on the inside, because you can only see one specific part of it. So I found that that was also kind of quite fascinating. And all this is leading up to the theory that I eventually sort of adopted and landed on, which is this one. Okay, so the CoCultural Theory. So this was developed in 1994. I want to be very clear, Dr. Mark Orby was not the creator of CoCultural Theory, but what he drew from it is completely coined to him. So this notion of the CoCultural Theory, a lot of communication theorists, they don't really use the terms minority, majority. They will use non-dominant and dominant, but they often use co-cultural. So they will say, we are all coexisting. We are all co-cultural groups that are existing together, but there are some co-cultural groups that have certain identity features that kind of put them at the top of the rung, right? So that's that concept of co-cultural. So what's very unique to CoCultural Theory is this phenomenological research methodology, all right? So what it means in just short layman terms, it's human science research. It is people sitting in a community or even individual sort of interviews, and not the way that you might normally think of interviews, which is here's this list of questions, please answer them, but to tell me about your experience doing X, and letting that person talk. And if you have a group of people, what interestingly happens is that as one person sort of says something, then another person is like, oh yeah, that happened to me. That's interesting because I went to the boss and I did this and I noticed it. Oh, hey, that happened to me too, right? So what Dr. Orby did during his graduate studies, he, again, in the communication field, and in his graduate program for his dissertation, he actually specifically focused on the African-American males that were in his graduate school. And he did this phenomenological sort of methodology research on them, which was just to literally have them sitting in a room sort of talking. And the question that really started it off was, how do you communicate with each other and how do you communicate with others around you? And that was it, right? So literally, how does the non-dominant group communicate? And then how does the non-dominant group communicate in the dominant setting? And so from that emerge some different things. So what you focus on is the conscious experience of the person as they are living in the world, okay? That's what he focused on. And I'm going to get to kind of what he pulled out from that at the next slide. But I was so enamored by his work. So again, remember, I'm doing my Google research that turned intellectual shortly thereafter. I was like, okay, let's go on some actual databases that are more helpful. And then I kept, once I found the Shirley and Edwin Ardener and kind of kept going with that round, then Dr. Orby and CoCultural kept flying up everywhere. I was like, okay, I got to figure out who this person is and I need to kind of do the research. I read some of his first earlier pieces of work and I was just so validated because I was like, yes, this is what I'm saying. It's a thing. It is a thing. It is actually a thing that non-dominant cultures, how they communicate in a dominant setting, that it's a thing and it's different and there's strategies to that. And I was like, this is what I've been looking for. So then I was like, I have to find this person, right? I just assumed that everybody was like dead, like Edwin Ardener. I was like, he's dead. I was like, is Dr. Orby alive? I hope he's alive. And he's very much so alive. He's alive, well, and kicking. And I found this man. And at the time that I found him, you stroke the ego a little bit. I'm like, you're so fascinating. And he happened to be doing a diversity sort of education training in Ohio, literally maybe like a month or so before I found him. Like, and then within the next month or so, he was doing this training. So we just got to talking. I shared some of my work, my thoughts, and he threw this training out there. He's like, okay, this is closed, but I think you would benefit from this. I was like, yes. So I scrambled to like get into this training. And I was in California at the time and flew to Ohio. And I attended this training. So you can kind of see at the top over here, it's a very fuzzy picture, but there's Dr. Orby and there's me, the other arrow. So I found this man and I sat in on this training and it was like 30 to 40 hours of very intensive training. And it was amazing. So what came from that? All right. So he did this research with these graduate students, and here's what came from that. And so this, I want to pause here as well. These communication orientations. So remember, he is not the one that came up with CoCultural Theory, but he is the one that sort of came up with this communication orientations. So what he did is that after listening to the interviews and doing sort of this transcription method on all of the interview information. So listening over and over again, first transcribing it from audio into written form, and then listening and reading over and over again for themes. Right. So it's not that any of the people that were that were part of the focus group actually used any of these words. Right. But he listened for themes. Right. And so that if somebody was like, OK, well, how do you all communicate both with each other and with sort of another dominant group? If somebody was just like, look, I just try to do my own thing, because I don't really like conflict, or if I feel uncomfortable, whatever, he was pulling out themes. And from that, he came up with, across the top row, the communication outcome. Were the themes rendered or sort of around that people wanted to separate, like, I don't want to have anything to do with the dominant group? Or, man, because of my labs or whatever that I'm sort of doing, I need to be in this space and I'm trying to kind of make friends. So, but I don't want to lose myself in the process. So maybe they were accommodating, and maybe some other people were like, look, I kind of threw my own culture to the side. And again, they may not necessarily be saying that, but the ways that they acted and the behaviors that they chose sort of rendered them as being assimilative, right? So then along the vertical axis is, what's your communication strategy, right? Are you sort of standoff in that you want to be non-assertive? Are you assertive, or are you aggressive? And so he was able to kind of thematically place these various communication practices based upon your communication strategy and the outcome that you want. And so he came up with all of these little boxes, and each of the, I won't go into this for today, but happy to send you the information, but each of these actually has kind of a definition with it, right? So that if you find yourself, okay, well, I kind of have a very non-confrontational sort of personality, but I want to get along with my peers and my colleagues who don't look like me. So I'm just gonna, if people, so I'm gonna go right here in the middle. If people ask me a question like, hey, Leslie, so do Black people always do this? I might stop and educate them in order to dispel a particular stereotype. Like, no, that's not really, that's not really true, right? Or if I want nothing to do with people that don't look like me, right? I'm just going to avoid, right? Oh, you're in the office, great. I'm not coming into the office. I'm going to totally avoid. If I am wanting to really be a part of them because that's just the choice that I've made, I might try to find all the ways that I'm like, my white colleagues, right? The other white women, oh, look, we have the same sweater. Oh, look, we have the same this. Oh, look, we have the same that, right? And so it's just a different matter of how am I going to kind of communicate and what is my particular communication strategy. So I found this fascinating because the legal scholarship did not have that many organizational tools, if you will, or communication, identity sort of strategy tools. All the tools really seem to lean towards assimilation. And so two of the really top names in the legal scholarship that deal with identity performance is Devin Carbato and Mitu Galati. So they wrote Acting White. And then Kenji Yoshini talks about covering. But all of that really, in my mind, as I read it, really led to assimilation. Are you going to pass? Right? Which is to say, I'm light skinned enough so I could pass as a white person, or my accent is such that I could pass this way, or maybe my religion is this, but I could pass as, this particular dominant religion. Am I going to cover something? So I might change some aspect of my name so that it is more whatever, right? Sort of American sounding, whatever kind of space you're kind of trying to fit in. What is the technique or strategy you're going to use? And they're real. And they talk about them, but they all seem to lead to assimilation. So that's where the feminist communication work opened up doors for me, because I was like, well, what if I don't want to assimilate? And what if my students are like, because I've had students ask me, like, Professor Culver, some of my Black male students are like, I want to wear dreads. Can I do that? Like, what do you think? And that's just not a question that my white students will ask me. They will never have to ask me about their hairstyle, right? But my Black students are asking me. They want to know, should they wait until they get the job to grow their dreads out, or could they do it in law school? Like, that's a real consideration for them, right? Because am I going to have to keep answering questions about my hair, or is it going to be deemed that I am not professional, all that sort of stuff. So what I did then with the CoCultural Theory framework is that, obviously, being in the legal profession, being a lawyer, I wanted to take that framework and kind of apply it to the legal profession setting. Okay, so there was this. I don't take credit for these quotes. There is a professor, and he's at Richmond Law School, I believe, Kevin Woodson, and he writes a lot about Black attorneys and the law firm and how they navigate this. So he definitely is very much so talking about identity performance. So he did in 2015, like 2014, 2015. Interviewed 75 Black attorneys at fairly mid-size and large firms, just to kind of what was their experience. So I took some of those quotes, right? Of course, gave credit to his work. I took some of those quotes and I said, if we were to apply the co-cultural theory framework and these communication practices on these quotes, what could we maybe be reading into these quotes, right? So here's the attorney that says there's just nothing that goes on that feels race related. I just don't, it's right. So they're not like feeling this sort of explicit, this person said this very rude thing to me from a race or ethnic standpoint, but I just don't feel plugged in, right? That's the only thing that I could say. I'm different and I don't know how to be the person that you want to have a drink with, right? And I remember that full well from my own experience. I don't know how to be the person that you want to like call up and like hang out with over the weekend or whatever. And then, you know, some other stuff that I'll kind of touch on momentarily. So it's not that they're going to say, okay, I want to assimilate. I don't want, they're not saying that, but what could we read in that, right? So I read in this was they wanted to try to fit in, right? There was a little bit of an ache to try to kind of get along in the firm setting and in the firm culture, but not really sure how to do that. So if I take that to the communication orientations from Dr. Orby, I might suggest that this person is trying to adopt a communication outcome of accommodation, right? I'm not trying to separate, but I'm not necessarily, there's nothing that I read in there that I'm totally trying to be like them in order to assimilate, right? So accommodation, the co-cultural group members functioning from an accommodation perspective, they insist that the dominant structures reinvent or at least change the rules a little bit, right? So that they incorporate the life experiences of each co-cultural group member. Because if you go out to, you know, we go out to have a drink or we go out for coffee or whatever at that point, you're going to be engaged with my life experiences, right? By my willingness to say, let's do that, you are going to engage with my life experiences. So I'm open, and that's for me personally, that's sort of my communication outcome is that accommodation, that like I want to be in this space and I want to have some genuine connections, but I'm not going to do so at the risk of my own culture and my own identity, right? So what might be the communication practices that I could do? So I could increase my visibility. If I stay away, never go out, never do any of those things, then I'm really operating from a separation sort of mindset. But if I want to be in the space, then I need to be there, right? So I'm increasing my visibility. I may really be intentional on communicating the things that are important to me, right? What are you doing this weekend? I might actually tell you the things that I'm doing this weekend, and maybe they differ from some of the stuff that you're doing, and that's totally fine. I'm going to use liaisons. I'm going to educate others, right? So I'm in this space, but I'm bringing my culture with me in efforts to kind of have some genuine connection. So then another one, I just pulled out two, but this is what my conscious identity article was about. I pulled out many of these and I sort of overlaid the co-cultural theory. So here was a quote that I thought could define the person that actually wants to separate. So this was another attorney that was interviewed. There's another layer of complication stress, almost like another layer of the job that you have to go through if you're not comfortable. So for example, if you don't want to go out and drink, there's annoyances, right? If you go to a firm event and you know there's going to be bad music, that's just the way it is. You almost ignore it. But why? Why is it that there are only certain genres? What it meant to go out and have a good time was very monolithic. I'm sure there are certain people who have a very difficult time adapting to that, or who have no desire to adapt and don't think it's worth the price. That mindset, again, overlaying the co-cultural theory, would be the person who is like, I'm good. I'm good. I'm going to completely separate. I don't really want anything to do with that. And so the behaviors that may accommodate a person who has made the conscious choice to separate, you're avoiding completely. You're maintaining your interpersonal barrier. Somebody was like, hey, we should do this. You're like, I'm good. You may not even show up. They may even have the opportunity to be like, do you want to do this? Because you're just simply not around, right? People are like, man, we never see Leslie. Well, she is just never here. Where is she? Right? I'm like, no, I'm good. I don't want to be involved. Right. And I can understand that as well. If you get to that point where there's nothing in that space where you're supposed to be working or learning, whatever, that feels like you, right? And so I can understand how people can get to that point. And this is where I ultimately have come to in terms of the article, I did not come up with the term identity performance, but I did conscious identity performance. Is that what would it look like for people to actually consciously perform their identity, knowing and being mindful of what is the outcome that you want and what is your sort of your communication strategy? Because then perhaps if somebody's like, well, I don't really know, I'm trying to make friends, but I look at your behavior and your behavior is total avoidance. I'm like, I hear you, right? But your behavior and your strategy that you've chosen is actually one that is quite separatist, right? Or the person who doesn't want to assimilate and trying to kind of hold their own, but they're never really standing up for their culture or their identity, but they're like, but this really means so much to me. I'm like, your behavior is actually saying something different. So it just the consciousness part of it, because much of the time we can kind of walk through these spaces unconscious of what we're doing, and that we've, somebody said our name wrong and we've let it slip. We're like, oh, that's fine. Somebody wants to call you a nickname and you're like, oh, that's fine. That's okay, right? It's not okay if you're actually trying to perhaps educate, dispel stereotypes, and you sort of want to accommodate, right? So my goal was to get myself and my students to kind of think about how are you consciously performing your identity? All right. So where did I kind of want to go with this? Where have I gone and where do I still hope to go? So here's sort of my vision for this. And so I teach in the legal methods program at College of Law. I had lawyering skills at UCI while I was at Cal Western, legal skills. It's always been something that's related to writing. So that's what I've been doing for 13 years. I absolutely love it, love it, love it, love it. I've also, though, from my research, have really dipped into thinking about obviously the identity performance, because that's just been my personal experience. So I've really enjoyed finding a way to merge these two things and think about legal writing as identity performance and not just sort of this performative thing that you are doing. So this was
Oh,
yes.
We had a question. I don't know
Good.
if you want to enter. They were just, the question is, isn't the CoCultural theory now rendering the racial concepts of majority and minority obsolete today to appease us as a non-dominant population?
Can you repeat that?
Yes. So isn't the CoCultural theory now rendering the racial concepts of majority and minority obsolete today to appease us as a non-dominant population?
That's a good question. That's a good question. My initial thought is no, but I don't want to be too quick with that response. One of the, and I hearken back to the reason why the communication theorists like to use the phrases co-cultural theory, because many, not all, of course, but many have felt that using minority, majority, that those terms are actually quite stigmatizing. But yet from the question, using those terms then can also kind of make clear who's kind of in what category. So I think that's actually what the co-cultural theory is attempting to do, is to kind of show the ways in which we are all alike, but at the same time, and hence my sort of saying, I don't know if it's taking away from it completely, they also recognize very clearly that there are certain co-cultural groups whose identities put them in a more I had to use the term, but a more privileged sort of category, that being European, male, able-bodied sort of person. I don't know if that totally answers that question, but I don't know yet that we're at that everybody's non-dominant. And interesting, if I can add on to that point, because it's actually sort of part of where I'm wanting to go. I just received a Fulbright, received it, had to withdraw from COVID and got it back. So there you go. But to go to South Africa to kind of explore that question. So that's why it kind of gave me a little bit of pause, because in South Africa, I have a colleague over there at one of the law schools, and statistically by number, right, there are more brown and Black bodies, yet their legal profession is still dominated by sort of a white normativity mindset. So even when I was talking with my colleague over there, I was like just blown away. I was like, no. And he was like, yes, Leslie, yes. He was like, it's still there. So even if we end up ethnicity wise, skin color wise, if you will, there is no sort of dominant, I'm actually interested in understanding why sort of whiteness can still dominate, even if that skin color is not dominating. So that's why I kind of hedge on that. So long-winded answer. I hope that is helpful, but thank you for that question. So then when I go to legal writing, so this was an interesting question that I had about 2 years ago from one of my students, Black male, and one of 2 Black males in my class. And we were working on his memo. His work was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. We were reviewing stuff, blah, 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 blah. And I'm kind of, feverishly sort of looking down, making some comments, getting ready to kind of respond. And I just remember this moment that he kind of like took this really deep breath, and he was, nervous to, hopefully that it was good. It was really, really good. And he was like, he said, I just don't want anyone to think this was written by a Black man, And that statement has stuck with me and has actually started a particular article that I actually just sort of finished and is in publication process. But this statement right here was the one that got me thinking about this fusion between legal identity and identity performance. Now, while his statement raises a whole bunch of questions that I didn't necessarily address because it may have been more of syntax and making sure that grammar-wise, things like that they were appropriate and no one would think anything different, it still got me thinking about, is writing gendered? Is writing raced in that way? And like, no way, that can't be, right? It's supposed to be objective. It's supposed to be neutral. And it's so not. It's so not. And that's what my work kind of took me on. I can't speak for all writing. I can only speak to legal writing. But where I went with this, and then I definitely want to kind of open up for more questions. Where I went with this is, and this was about a 2-year project. This is probably the hardest piece that I have ever written because there was no framework for it already. I kind of had to figure out a way to bring this theory to life. And so little tidbits on me, I'm obsessed with 2 things, both the Food Network and Wicked the musical. So there you go. There's all the life of Leslie Culver that you might want to know. And so the Food Network, you're going to see, is going to come into play. It's very, very important to the story. But Wicked, the musical, I've been obsessed with The Wizard of Oz. When Wicked came out, I have seen it 5 or 6 times, like live, first time on Broadway. And I was mesmerized by it. And so what I did was I compared in this piece Wicked to the analytical frameworks and a very in-depth analytical framework and process of writing, to the Glinda, the Good Witch, to a very sort of perfunctory, reductive, formulaic kind of writing. So sorry, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Wicked, hopefully you've seen or at least heard of Wizard of Oz. You've got Good Witch, Glinda, the whole thing. And then in the Wizard of Oz, right, of course, you've got this Wicked Witch of the West. What Wicked does, it tells you the story of the Wicked Witch of the West from her point of view. And you cannot, I don't care if you like the musical or not, you cannot walk away from that musical thinking about her the way that she was framed in The Wizard of Oz. You just can't. Like, I can't even go back and watch The Wizard of Oz the same way, because she has life, she has depth, she has character. You begin to understand the choices that she both made and the choices that were made for her. But where I took this was, for me, that was the visual perspective of giving depth to legal analysis, right? So bringing my conscious identity performance into legal writing, I created sort of an analytical framework that I like to use, but I talk about how do we consciously engage in legal analysis. And so I won't read all this, you can read it on the screen, but basically I wanted my students to engage with legal analysis thoughtfully, critically, skillfully. I wanted to be holistic. Think about the standpoint theory, right? The elephant. I wanted them to be able to walk all the way around the room, all the way around, and see everybody's perspectives as real and true and lived, and think about, how do we get that before the court? When should we get that before the court? I wanted them to see even legal writing, even if they're writing a motion or whatever, something that maybe feels very, well, this is how it has to be. I wanted them to still find the human experience for their client, or be able to raise something for the court. And maybe that's a policy consideration. They have to do it. And, we talk strategically about where you do that, but I wanted them to see the opportunity to bridge cultural gaps, to give voice to the voiceless, to dismantle power. These are all things that the Wicked Witch of the West did in Wicked, right? So you see how she interacts with the lion cub and the scarecrow and what she does. And it's very different when you see the story from her point of view. So that's what I sort of did in this particular piece. And so then from that, Here we go to the Food Network. My analytical framework that I created, again, I'm a Food Network junkie and loved watching Chopped. I am definitely a cook. And I remember my husband and I were watching Chopped. This was like a couple of years ago. So remember, I'm kind of in the throes of thinking about this. Maybe this is like 2 years ago. And you know, you got Chopped, right? And so they come up with their basket, open their basket, and they're like, okay, you got gummy bears, you got a pig's foot, and you got snap green peas. And they're like, do something, go, right? And then all of a sudden, they're like, I present for you, judges, a deconstructed sushi. And I'm like, how did you get to that from what you had? And my husband, who used to kind of work in a kitchen, I remember him kind of yelling out from the side. I think he was actually in the kitchen. And he was like, what did he tell me? Flavor profile. I was like, what? He's like, flavor profile, that's what they know. And I was like, huh. So I looked that up and I was like, that's a thing. It's good to know. So the elements of a flavor profile, you can tell what if food is spicy or the temperature, the sweet, bitter, and you take whatever it is. And if you say, oh, it's too sweet, I know to reduce it down. It's too spicy, let me add something to kind of help out the spiciness. So they can take anything and create something. I am a cook, I need a recipe, right? But I wanted to teach my students to be chefs. So which means they needed to understand the genres and the conventions of writing in order to sort of create. So that is then where I came up with the rhetorical profile, right? So instead of saying, here is this formula, here is this ingredient list, go, because if any ingredient was changed, they would be lost and they would be emailing me to try to figure out what to do. So we start with talking about genres, conventions, and then how do you identify and all the questions that need to be asked along the way so that they can be in depth as they're going and they can figure out, man, this question wasn't really addressed by the courts, but I think it's really important. Man, that may be an opportunity to give human experience to something, right? So I won't go too in depth into that, but that's what I created with that. So that's where I took identity performance and brought it into my legal analysis world. The other couple things that I just recently did was an empirical study. Did this in spring, summer 2019 with 2 others. So remember I told you I got the chance to meet Dr. Orby. He was gracious enough to do this research with me, as well as another PhD candidate, and he now just received his PhD, Dr. Rob Rosante. And so we interviewed about 50 attorneys across the country, both in person and then some online, about their communicative experiences. And we engaged in that phenomenological research method, which was trying to just let them talk and then reading through the transcripts over and over and over again to come out with some themes, okay? And so from that particular work, I have a couple of things kind of in the pipeline, the chief of which right now is a book manuscript that I'm working on called The Pale Veil. And so I have 600 pages of transcript from that study, but because right now I'm really fascinated on thinking about whiteness, and I don't, not white people, but whiteness and how it functions. And so this particular book manuscript that I'm working on right now got 1 chapter done, but it's focusing just on the interviews of the white male attorneys, or those perceived as or identified as white, and looking at the themes and how they view or think about cultural differences. And it's been mind-blowing to me because I came into this work assuming, and I was wrong, assuming that there was sort of this malicious, like, yeah, we know that we are on top of the hierarchy and we love it here and it's so great. And that just wasn't there. There was almost a huge blind spot, not to the fact that, okay, I look around me and everybody sort of in my law firm is sort of like, kind of looks like me. But then there was this, yeah, no, I don't like that. Like, I'm not totally comfortable with that, but they didn't really sort of know what to do with it. And if you mention cultural insider or outsider, they did not know. Most of, like, only one person knew what that term meant. For somebody else was sort of like microaggression. Like, I hear about that, but like, what is that? And I just had to have some empathy. I was like, you really don't know. We're really clueless here. Okay. So it shifted. And I can't say that for everybody, so please hear me on that. But it kind of shifted. Like, how do we do this right now, right? How do we have these conversations if you're talking with a particular group that really does not see, right? Standpoint theory, the elephant really does not see something from the way that you are seeing it. And I want to bring unity and not continual division. So it's really challenged me to think about different ways to talk about this. So this book is for them, but I'm having to really think very carefully about how do I engage you so that you want to read this and you want to be a part of this conversation. So that's something that I'm working on. Rhetorical Profile, which I just showed you, sort of like making that be its own essay. And then I'm very excited that I recently just received a seed research grant for some data, some other data that I've been doing and working with law students and talking about cultural awareness and identity performance and trying to think about how do we engage law students that are about to be attorneys sort of in this work. I'm currently teaching identity and power and professional responsibility, which is completely coming from the side training, the diversity training that I did with Dr. Orby and a lot of that work. And I'm basically paying it forward. That was one of my goals, to actually have these conversations in the classroom. Some other tentative course ideas in the works: cross-cultural communication in the law, advanced topics in identity. So I'm also like toying around the idea of what would it look like for a school institution to kind of have a certificate of cultural awareness, to, you know, kind of graduate students with a bit more tools in their pocket as they go out into their spaces. And then the last one that I want to leave you with is this. So I've done numerous workshops, conversations. I like to call them conversations, not trainings, conversations with students, faculty around the country. A couple years ago, I was at Oregon as a visitor for a bit. And one of the students from there then emailed me this, you know, following our talk. I actually wanted to email you because of something that happened in my particular class. It really played into what we were talking about in terms of when and where white allies should step into hard conversations. We're talking about the reforms in the criminal justice. One person just insisted that everything is a choice and that no rehabilitation should be in the criminal justice system or in the First Step Act in Congress right now. There are only 4 people of color in this class. And once he said that, it was only us 4 fighting vigorously against this idea because we can't ignore systemic racism. But there are white people in our class that constantly talk about social justice and are considered social justice warriors. But when this conversation happened, all those kids were silent. And I think that would have been a prime time to discuss this issue, not to make the 4 people of color fight back against this idea that ignores racism in our country. So where I am at now is I am really intentionally, that resonates with me. And I think about, how do I bring this into the classroom? How do I challenge and engage all students, not just students of color? How do I challenge and engage all students to think about these, to wrestle with these, to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and to kind of move the needle a bit forward? So that's my work. That's my work. Thank you so much. So Malijah, I will turn it back over to you if there are any questions. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you so much. I know we just had a lot of people leave in the last couple of minutes because they probably had another meeting to go to, which is perfectly fine. But for those that did stay behind, we have about, I would say, roughly 10 minutes. If anybody would like to have a question, and since we have a smaller group, you can just unmute your mic and ask.
Hi, my name is Tiana. I just graduated with my master's degree in educational leadership policy from the University of Utah. So whoop whoop, we're in there, and I'm planning on studying for the LSAT and also going to law school. So that's the next big step. But thank you. I have 2 questions kind of. One is personal and one is about this. So I'll go with what's about this. So when you're talking about CoCultural theory, is that similar to code switching, or is that like a completely different like realm? Like, is it kind of different in that way?
Great question. I would say it could be a communication practice. Yes. So if I am code switching, the question is, am I doing it in efforts to assimilate, right? And so it can fall kind of, you go back to thinking about that chart. What am I doing it for? But sometimes it's a protective measure, and it's like you in your mind know, like, I'm in no way trying to assimilate in this moment, but I'm kind of, it's a strategy that I kind of am needing to push through. So I think you could kind of figure out where it needs to fall. But yeah, I could see it falling in that chart for sure.
Right. Okay. Amazing. And then this other one is just super simple. What do you think is the best way to study for the LSAT? I was like, since you've already
since I'm here.
Yeah.
If you have the reason, I tell this to anybody. So because I directed a program, so I would always talk to students that are getting ready to go to law school. My answer always, if you have the resources to be able to do a program that will actually a prep program that will take you through the LSAT studying. That is hands down what I would do. If you are disciplined enough to study on your own, go for it. You can get books, you can do the practice exams, but you have to be very, very disciplined to kind of put that structure into place. And so there's many programs, they can be very expensive, but they kind of run the gamut. But the one thing that I would say very quickly regarding the LSAT is don't start too soon. Don't take a year to do it. Like the same thing with you just don't, because you're just not going to retain that information and you're going to have burnout. The LSAT is four times a year. So studying like 2.5 months or so before it happens is plenty enough time.
Okay, thank you. I was like, I always thought like studying farther in advance.
No, you will burn out and die. Yeah. So if you want to take like the June LSAT, if you want to take like the June LSAT, there's a prep program that would probably start like in March. So you're studying like, March, April, May-ish. Then you kind of take a little break and you kind of review on your own, and then you take that test.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Any other questions from the audience?
Yeah, and if anybody ever has like any other kind of follow-up thoughts, maybe this is not the forum, right? That you want to kind of, you can always reach out to Elijah and get my email, or look me up, right? I'm on the Utah website, and then find me. We'd be happy to talk and engage further, for sure. Such a pleasure being here.
Yes, thank you, Professor Culver.
I
very much appreciate this. But thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody.